So we are here now at the next part of the story of Jesus as recounted in the Gospel of John. We completed the first section, which we called the opening adventure. And so far what we did, we went back to the start of time and we saw Jesus at the start of time. We then met John the Baptist, we met the disciples of Jesus, we even got dates, solid dates for these events that took place. Next we're moving into this next section of John, which we're going to make its own series. And this looks at the miracles of Jesus, the controversial things Jesus said, and his interactions at some of the Jewish feasts. So this series, this section, is going to take us from John chapter 2 all the way to John chapter 12. So we're going to be covering that over this next bit. And as a theme, you will notice something week by week as we go through these chapters and through these stories. Because a lot of the stories John tells have a very similar pattern to them. Not necessarily this week, but as we go, you'll notice that there's a very similar pattern. They'll usually start with Jesus saying something amazing, or doing something absolutely amazing. And then what happens is people respond by either being amazed, or getting really angry, or completely misunderstanding what Jesus is saying. Or all of those things at once. So we're calling this section the good, the controversial, and the miraculous. And we're picking up now a few days after Jesus calls his disciples. So we went through a timeline of Jesus getting baptized, 40 days in the wilderness. He starts gathering his disciples, and now a few days later, Jesus and his disciples attend a wedding in Cana in Galilee, which is a bit of a trek if you look at the map from where Jesus called Nathanael. So they must have gone pretty much straight there to get to this wedding in time. Cana is a region of Galilee, not near the lake. That's the lake up that side there. And you see Cana's all the way on the left here. It's written in red, so it's a little harder to see. So that's where Cana is. So it's actually not too far away from Nazareth. If you see, Nazareth is just below it, to the left a little bit there. And you can't see so much from this map, but Cana there is about halfway between Galilee and the Mediterranean. It's about in the middle of that bit of the country, between there and Jaffa, just about in the middle. So it's in the region of Galilee, but it's not too close to Galilee. It's a little way out. Now, it appears when you read John 21:2 that Cana is the hometown of Nathanael, who Jesus has just called to be a disciple. Nathanael, of course, has just been brought on, so we can read that in John 21:2, near the end of John. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, or as we've gone through, Twinny. Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. So Nathanael is a local to where this wedding's taken place. So Nathanael's there, Jesus is there, and it says, and his disciples. It doesn't say how many of his disciples were at this wedding. But as we looked at, there may have been a strong family connection between all of these guys anyway. So it would make sense if you had a family connection, you'd be invited to the wedding, yeah? Nathanael specifically seems very likely to have had a connection to the wedding party because this is his hometown. Bear in mind, we're never told whose wedding this is. Could have been one of the disciples. We don't know. It's never specifically said whose wedding, but Nathanael was from here. So I think that there's a connection that got the disciples who were there invited to the wedding. It's hardly like you'd give Jesus a plus 12 when you sent the invite out. It's a bit much as well to turn up with all of your 12 disciples when your ministry hasn't started yet. So it would make sense that the disciples who were there would probably have been there regardless. Let's take a look at John's account of this wedding. I'm going to read from John 2, verses 1 to 12. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now we'll get into that bit in a bit. His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water had now become wine and did not know where it came from, although the servants who drew the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. And that little section we'll get to next week. There is something about this first miracle, this first sign, that for 2,000 odd years has absolutely intrigued us. It just captures our imaginations so well. This idea of turning one substance into another one. It's one of those ones that makes you go, wow. And the idea that Jesus did it with wine, well, that's a little bit more exciting. It's a miracle that has been imitated, or rather faked, by countless stage performers. It's one of the few miracles that of Jesus that a person on the street could tell you about right away. There's comedy sketches about this, because there's something about the idea of wine coming from water that just captures people's imagination. Because people prefer wine to water. All throughout history, it has given the church as well this kind of awkward relationship with this miracle. Yes, Jesus turned water into wine, but we don't agree with drinking wine. What do we do? You know, it's kind of put people in that funny position when, especially people who take the teetotal line, they've kind of gone, well, what do we do? We have to say it wasn't really wine. Panic, everybody. We need to change what happened here. I've heard it said that the first miracle of Jesus was to turn water into wine, but one of the first miracles of the church was to turn wine into grape juice. But no, it was wine. Not only that, from the master of the feast, we know it was good wine, the best wine. And the one problem with this miracle is you can get stuck in this conversation. We could have a whole conversation about that, but there's far more going on there, just other than whether it's okay to drink wine or not. You know, the Gospel of John gives us such a richness in it. John specifically, because he was writing last, cherry-picked stories to tell about Jesus. And he picked them carefully. I imagine the first draft of his gospel was like, phew. But he picked the ones that he really wanted to talk about. Because he wanted to tell you more than just the story. He wanted to bring in a depth. And he wanted to talk about the deeper meaning. And in John's gospel, for those who are willing to dig into it, there's so much deeper meaning. So what we're going to do tonight is, first of all, we're going to take a look at the events. Then we'll go a little bit deeper into what it tells us about Jesus. and what it tells us about his mission. So if we do the events first. They are there at a wedding feast. Jesus is there, the disciples are there, and Mary is there. Now, not only is Mary present, but if she can order the servants about and knows that they've run out of wine, she's involved in the organizing of this wedding somehow. On what level? I couldn't tell you. But she's somehow involved in the organization. Now, bear in mind, the whole time we're reading this and we're looking at this whole situation with the wine running out and the miracle that takes place, this is all happening under the radar. Most of the people at the wedding haven't a clue this has happened. In other words, the guests at the wedding had no idea there was a problem. They didn't know the wine had run out. In fact, the master of the feast didn't know the wine had run out. And none of them knew that Jesus was the one who brought the solution to the problem. When the master of the feast tastes the wine, he doesn't go, "Wow, what an amazing miracle took place there." He goes, "Wow, that's good wine. Well done, bridegroom." He doesn't bring up Jesus and say, "Do you know what Jesus has just done?" He brings up the bridegroom and goes, "Look at this guy. He kept the best wine till last." So the master of the feast, not a clue what's going on. All these events that we're reading about, they're observed by John, they're observed by the disciples, they're observed by the servants, but not the guests at the wedding. This is, of course, another indication that Mary was heavily involved in the organizing and was part of the family, probably, that was involved in the wedding, who was getting married. Mary has enough authority that when she tells the servants what to do, they do what she asked, even though what she asks is just do whatever Jesus says. We don't know how many of the disciples are there. It's not mentioned in any of the other Gospels. We don't know how many of the disciples were aware of the situation going on. I'm assuming John was, because John's the one who's talking about it as if he's been there firsthand and seen it. And he chose to tell this story that nobody else had really mentioned much, not because people didn't mention it because it wasn't amazing. People didn't mention it because this one happened quietly before Jesus' ministry even began. Joseph is not mentioned as being at this wedding. The most probable explanation is Joseph is dead at this point. We don't know when. I know many people have many ideas as to when Joseph died. It may have been many years ago, and that Jesus looked after his family and is now only stepping into his mission because his brothers and sisters will have been older. I don't know. That's really, you can only speculate when it comes to those things. But he certainly doesn't seem to be in the picture at this point. The wine runs out, and Mary tells Jesus about it. Now, the first thing that we might ask when we're looking at this is, the wine ran out, okay. What's the big deal? So what? Worse things happen at sea, you know. Of all the things that could go wrong at a wedding, is running out of wine really that high on the list of things that can go wrong at a wedding? But for a Jewish wedding feast, making sure there was enough wine was essential. Wine was a symbol of celebration, a symbol of joy. It still is today in Israel. The rabbis would say, without wine, there is no joy. And I'm sure everybody gave a hearty amen to that. For a wedding to run out of wine is to cast a shadow not just over the day, but over the marriage. It's not that people needed lots of wine to get drunk. In fact, if you were at a wedding and you were drunk, you were considered to be a disgrace. But wine was considered an essential component, and a failure of provision was a massive problem. In Israel, hospitality was considered a sacred duty. Failing in hospitality was a source of shame. If this had got out, the bride and the bridegroom would have been humiliated in a way we don't understand. It would have been the wedding people talked about for years, and not in a good way. So it's not that the people were drunkards, it was that there was an expectation that had been let down. Anyone watch the last series of The Apprentice? They ran out of wine. They were doing a corporate event. And as part of it, they promised this business who was booking the corporate event an unlimited drinks package. Then they realized they didn't have the budget for it. So they thought, that's okay. No one will notice. So instead of unlimited drinks, the clients got one at arrival and one when they boarded the train that the event was taking place on. Needless to say, the guests weren't happy. And that group lost the task that week. Not because everybody wanted to get drunk, although I'm sure on a corporate event there was some who did, but because a promised expectation wasn't met. Well, that's the problem this wedding found itself in. And Mary finds herself in the middle of this problem. I'm not sure even the bridegroom knew at this point that they'd run out of wine. Because once you're the bridegroom and the bride of a wedding, you're kind of just carried along on the wave, aren't you? You have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. This was something that was happening behind the scenes and was imminently about to derail the whole event. It was like that train heading towards you, but you don't know it's coming yet. Now, another question that pops up immediately when you read this is, what on earth is Mary thinking? Why now? Why this? Why does Mary think that Jesus can and will do something about them running out of wine? Jesus has not started his ministry yet. We haven't got to that stage. He starts his ministry next week by turning tables over. But nothing's happened yet. He's not preached yet. He's not spoke yet. He's not done anything yet. He's performed no miracles yet. As John said, this is the first. Now we know that for years and years, Mary has stored up the things that happened at the birth of Jesus in her heart. She brought Jesus up knowing he is Emmanuel, he is the Messiah. But she doesn't necessarily know what that means at this point. In fact, there's conflict further down the line because she doesn't know what this means yet. But she knows Jesus has a very significant destiny and a very significant future. She will have been aware that a few weeks ago, John baptized Jesus. She'll have known that just after that, Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness preparing. She'll also know Jesus is now gathering disciples because they're at the wedding. So those things that had been pondered in her heart, I wonder whether they came back up to the surface here. This is the time. Jesus is about to step into what was foretold. You see, creating plenty out of lack was not unheard of. Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, we read about the flour and the oil that did not run dry. There was a precedence for this kind of thing. I wonder whether that came to mind for Mary. Because if that power is available to a prophet, it would be a fair assumption that it's available to the Messiah. I don't know what's going on in Mary's head here. Because it doesn't immediately seem like the best use of Jesus. But there's a need. And it has serious consequences, especially for two people, the bride and bridegroom. So she turns to her son in the hope that that need might be met. It seems likely she doesn't know how. Would she have expected water to get turned into wine? I don't think so. But she was expecting something. And Jesus' reply to Mary isn't what you might expect. He says, "Woman, what has this to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Woman, what does this have to do with me? It sounds kind of rude, doesn't it? And a bit dismissive. I mean, I get, it kind of feels like the sort of thing you'd want to say, but wouldn't dare say to your mum. She's not here tonight, so I can say that. It sounds like the sort of thing you'd get into trouble for calling your mum woman. You know, I did that once as a kid. I just remembered that. I mean, we're talking like 4 years old at this point or something. And my mum was telling me off for something because, hey, I was 4 years old. I'd done something wrong. I can't believe I said this. I stood in the room like a little brat and went, "Woman, kitchen." She's never let me forget that one. It sounds like the sort of thing that you'd get into trouble for. Woman. But it's not that. This is the same word Jesus uses when he's on the cross, and he asks John to look after his mother. It's the same way that the Roman Emperor Augustus would address Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. It's polite and formal. It's not rude and formal. Instead of thinking, woman, think, lady. It's polite. He's being polite to his mum. He's calling her respectfully. So when you read that, don't think he's being rude, he's being respectful. However, he then follows it up with, what's this got to do with me? Again, that sounds dismissive and impolite. It actually is a pretty common conversational phrase, one that could be said sharply or gently. If you said it gently and politely, it had a different meaning than if you said it sharply. So what has this to do with me is kind of like, why are you asking me about this? This kind of like, is there something you want me to do? Because she hasn't actually asked him anything. She's just told him the problem. So it's a little bit like, why are you telling me about the wine that's run out? And then he says, my hour has not yet come. What hour is that? Was it the hour to be revealed as who he was? Well, Jesus would often talk. It was at the hour of miracles. It's not because he's about to do one. John has several references to Jesus' hour. Jesus said, my hour has not yet come, quite a lot. In John 7 and 8, he says, my hour has not yet come. It's when we get to John 12, just before the events leading up to the crucifixion, that Jesus says, his hour has now come. Jesus' hour was the reason for his mission, was the entire reason he came here, and that was to die for our sins. So when Jesus says, my hour has not yet come yet, there's almost a suggestion that he's saying, this isn't what I'm here for. This isn't my mission. And as a church, we need to understand sometimes we can get way distracted by doing things that are helpful but not our mission. And for a long time, the church has fallen into that trap, hasn't it? Doing good things, but it's not the mission of the church. That's why everybody thinks we're here for bake sales and cakes. Because for a long time, that's been what the church has done. So Jesus is like, that's not what I'm here for. However, he is going to do something. But he's not going to make a show of it. He's not going to do it publicly. Mary might have been expecting a public miracle because she knows Jesus is about to start his mission. This would have been the perfect opportunity to make a splash. But Jesus says, what's this got to do with me? This isn't how I'm going to do things. My hour has not yet come. But he cares. And he does a miracle that, except to a few people, doesn't make people think, who is this man? It's not showy. It's not public. It's done quietly. Mary expects something showy, I'm sure, but if Jesus had stood up there in front of everybody and said, I am going to turn water into wine because the wine has run out, that would have been just as humiliating for the bride and groom as running out. Instead, he acts compassionately, quietly, and keeps their dignity because his hour has not yet come. So Mary says to the servants, do as Jesus says. Incidentally, that's the best advice anyone can ever give you. Now remember, as we discussed right at the start of John, John is writing in a very specific context. He's living in a Gentile city, and he's writing to an ever more Gentile church. And he's specifically writing a gospel that can be understood by Jews and by Greeks alike. So as a result, John explains some stuff that another writer mightn't explain because they assume everybody knows it. So John tells us exactly what the water jars were and what they were for. He says, now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification. I get the sense if Matthew had wrote about this, he wouldn't have said that. He just said, jars of water, because everybody knows what they're there for. Each holding, again, he talks about the size of them, 20 or 30 gallons. That leads me to believe they're slightly different in size. So we get the amount of jars, we get the reason for having the jars, and we get how much they hold. That's a pretty good level of detail. He says they were for the rites of purification. John tells us that. That encompasses 2 uses. First of all, you would cleanse or purify your feet upon entry to a house. Because outside, it's dusty. Your feet would be dusty and your sandals would be caked in it. I mean, anyone who's spent any time walking around in Israel knows that your shoes are ridiculous by the end of it. So you'd come into a house and you would use water to cleanse your feet. If it was a dry day, it was dust. If it was a wet day, it was mud. Either way, it's all over your feet and you need cleaning. So these water pots were available for that. Remember as well, around tables at a wedding feast, how do you sit? How do this? You don't sit. You lie down. So your feet are a lot more visible than they would have been if they were just under a table. So you want to make sure you clean your feet. Secondly, they would be used for hand washing before touching food because you had to make sure you're cleansed before touching food. So for the outside observer, we get a reason for the jars that were there and the size. 6 of them, not just able to hold a lot, but to hold 20 to 30 gallons each. Jesus commands that these jars should be filled to the brim. It's very specific, isn't it? Why the brim? Maybe that's to show there's nothing tricky going on. Maybe it's to show that when Jesus does something, he brings absolute, complete abundance. And he tells them, draw the water out and take it to the master of the feast. Now, let me ask you a question. There's not necessarily an answer to this question, but let me ask it. When does the miracle take place? The jars don't appear to be full of wine, they're full of water. Does it happen when it's in the cup? When he does that? Or is it when the master of the feast takes a drink? And the answer to that question is, I don't know. But I think it's an interesting question. Because for the servants, they don't know what to expect. Jesus didn't say, draw some and give it to the master of the feast, and by the time you get there, it's going to be wine. He didn't say that. He says, draw some and give it to the master of the feast. It's not until we hear the remarks of the master of the feast that anybody realizes something's happened. So it's not happened in the jars. It's happened later. My guess, if you looked at the jars, you would still just see water in them. It's only when it's taken from the cup, from them in the cup, something happens. It says, when the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water, so they drew water, knew. So he doesn't know what's happened, but the servant does. I think there's a lesson in there, by the way. Sometimes when we're praying for a miracle, we wait until we see the wine in the jar. Waiting for that confirmation before we move. Waiting for confirmation that we know it's happened before we act. But the servants just obeyed. They drew out water. They just acted. Let me tell you, faith requires action. Because what's faith without works? Dead. The servants just drew the water out. And the action that you're asked to take when waiting for a miracle will often be without the reassurance that the miracle's actually happened. Sometimes we're waiting to see confirmation for the miracle. Sometimes we are waiting for the miracle to take place. But sometimes the miracle is waiting for us to take action before it takes place. Just as the servants did, do what Jesus asked. Anyway, that's just a thought. He gives the cup to the master of the feast. If you'd like, the master of the feast is kind of like the head waiter. You know, he's the guy who's making sure everything's running well. He's the one who was about to find out there's no wine. And when he takes it, he's astonished. Not because he's witnessed a miracle, because he doesn't know he's witnessed a miracle. He's impressed that this bridegroom has not just catered, but this bridegroom has gone above and beyond and kept the best wine till later. This guy drinks it and thinks, this bridegroom is one classy guy. I mean, this is a classy move. Kudos to the bridegroom. Because he doesn't know a miracle's happened. The bridegroom, therefore, who was on the cusp of humiliation, whether he knew it or not, is now become highly honored. His reputation to everyone in the room has just gone through the roof when it was just about to go down there. Not because of anything he did, but because of something Jesus did. Here, at a small village wedding, Jesus showed a glimpse of the glory that was to come. A small, under-the-radar glimpse that only certain people knew about, including his disciples. Can you imagine being one of the disciples and witnessing this? You're following this guy. You haven't been following him long, a couple of days. This one who you believe is going to be a great teacher, a prophet. The word Messiah kind of hasn't come on the cards yet for you. That's not happened yet. And you see this? I tell you what, it would certainly intrigue you as to what's coming next. Before we move on just from these surface facts, there's three amazing things just to take note of. First of all, this happened at a wedding. Now, I know that doesn't sound amazing, but it is. Jesus was perfectly at home at a wedding. This happy occasion where wine is served. Jesus wasn't a severe boring killjoy tutting at everybody who was having fun at the wedding. No, Jesus shared in a happy event. Some Christians can bring down an entire room just by walking into it. A cloud of gloom follows wherever they may go. That's people who are not acting like Jesus, because when Jesus walked into a room, people loved having him there. People embraced him. People wanted to be around him. I tell you, if we could just learn to be a bit more like Jesus in that regard, evangelism will be a whole lot easier. If Jesus saw that there was nothing wrong with enjoying life and having a good time with the people he loved, then why should his followers? Second thing is, this happened quietly and below the radar. A wedding in a small village, not a grand city or a big occasion, not in front of a king. And most people who were there didn't even know it had happened. There's no, look at what I've done. I've turned water into wine. Because that would have been entirely against the point of saving this couple from humiliation. And that leads us to why it happened. It happened out of kindness. Shame was going to fall upon this household. This couple would have been hugely embarrassed. And Jesus performed this miracle to save this family from Cana, the humiliation they were about to suffer, because Jesus is kind. It happened out of kindness. See, many people can do the big thing on the big occasion, but Jesus does the big thing on the small, simple occasion. Jesus was fun to be around. He didn't worry about making a splash. He was more concerned with helping people and showing people kindness. I wonder if we'd been at that wedding, we might not have acted quite like Jesus. Because there's something in human nature that enjoys things going wrong for other people. Getting critical of other people, or something going wrong at a wedding. That would be some juicy conversation for the trip home, wouldn't it? Can you believe they ran out of wine? Shocking. Shocking. Just wait till I get on Twitter. We didn't run out of wine at our wedding. No. We thought ahead. Oh, their poor parents. I really don't know how they're going to get over this. I need to share this with everybody I meet so they can pray about it. Incidentally, just adding, I want you to pray about this at the end, doesn't stop something being gossip. Oh, I'm going to see a few of my old friends in a few weeks' time. Oh, I'll tell you what, I can't wait to get to them and say, you'll never guess what happened at a wedding I was at recently. That's the unfortunate side of human nature. But if we were to truly take on the nature of Christ, our response would be like his. To help people simply protect their dignity and be kind. It might not seem like a big deal. We can't do what he did. But the simplest kindness can display the likeness of Christ in our lives. And I think that's one thing we need to learn to be better at, is kind. So that's the surface level of the story. What else is going on there here? What's going on the way John tells it? What is John cleverly weaving in? Because I tell you, the more you look at John, the more you realize how clever John is. Well, again, remember this is to both Jew and Greek. And he's weaved this in such a way that both Jewish and Greek readers would get something different out of this. John recorded details in a certain way to make specific points. He's very careful with his words. And he uses those words to describe what's going on. Let's start, first of all, with the Jewish. First of all, he mentions specifically 6 water pots, not 7. See, according to the Jews, 7 is the number of perfection. 7 is the number of completeness, whereas 6 is imperfect. 6 is unfinished. And these 6 water pots are symbolic as well. They represent something that's imperfect. And what was imperfect was the system of the law. The law was not perfect because man kept on failing. And John's telling us that into the law is poured the loving grace of Jesus that does away with the imperfections, with the new wine of his gospel. The imperfections of the law have been changed into the perfection of grace. That's important to a Jewish reader, you see. We mightn't place any significance in the numbers, but a Jewish reader would. But there's something else here. And I just got to do the maths, I'm sorry. Because that's just the way my mind works. Not that I'm good at math, I just get inquisitive about things. 6 pots, each hold in between 20 to 30 gallons of water. Well, let's go top end, let's say 30. That became wine. How much wine's that? Well, if you take 30 as the figure, that is 180 gallons of wine. Now, the average bottle of wine is around about 750 milliliters. Average one you get in a shop. Or Schlur. That means it's the equivalent of 1,090 bottles of wine. Now, I don't think you need me to tell you, that's a lot of wine. And I still can't work out, I don't think a wedding party in a small village that's nearly finished, because they were running out, is going to go through 1,000 bottles of wine. And here's the point. Jesus isn't about just providing enough. When it comes to the grace we've been given through Jesus, he's not just providing enough, he's providing abundantly. He is providing overflowing. There is more grace from Jesus coming at you than you could ever use. They were never going to finish this amount of wine. They didn't need that much to get to the end of the wedding, but Jesus gives more than what's required. John is telling the Jewish reader the grace that brings perfection to the law, and the grace of Jesus is so abundant. There is more grace available to you than you will ever need. You are never going to run out of the grace of Jesus. And I say a big amen to that, because I need it every day of my life. Let me tell you, you can never use up all the grace that Jesus has towards you. There's then the message to the Greek reader. It's interesting, because the Greeks already had stories about gods who made wine. But they were just that. They were stories. And everybody knew that. They knew the deal. The Greek god of wine was called... I coughed there to disguise the fact that I don't know how to pronounce this. Dionysus. There we go. Greek god of wine. In Rome, he was known as... Thank you, Bacchus. You see, wine played an important part of their culture, just as it did in Jewish culture. And they had a ritual in Greece where they would take 3 empty vessels up into the temple, and by the priests, and the next day they'd be full of wine. But it was a ritual. It was a story. It wasn't solid, and everybody knew what happened. They put wine in it. And John's saying to the Greek reader, yeah, you've got your stories, you've got your legends. Well, the person I'm talking about really did this. The person I'm talking about really did what you've only dreamt about. You have a trick that happens behind the scenes. Jesus did it in the middle of a party. You know they're only stories, but this is real. Jesus can do what you only dreamed your gods could do. So to the Jews, John is saying that Jesus came to turn the imperfect law into grace. To the Greeks, he's saying he came to do the things you only ever dreamed of. And the point of this story, I don't like calling it a story, but you get it's been told as a story, is not that Jesus turned some water into wine. Because ultimately that's not the point. Although sometimes it's the only bit we focus on. The point is that in doing this, Jesus showed that he brings transformation like nobody else. That Jesus can take the ordinary and he can turn it into something extraordinary. Without Jesus, life is like water. It's dull, it's flat, and it's tasteless. But with him, life is like wine. It is transformed into something so much more joyful. The difference Jesus makes in a person's life is bigger than the difference between water and wine. When you come to him, you become a new creation. You become made new. You become something else. And John is saying, if you want this life, if you want this fresh, exciting, new you, then the way to do it is to follow Jesus and let him transform you like he transformed water. This was the first sign that Jesus performed, according to John. He'll use that term a few times. Sign. Signs point somewhere. That's what signs are for. This sign points to the person who can bring complete transformation. But remember, these signs are all pointing forward to a coming kingdom. Because you know there's a wedding feast still to come. The wedding feast of the Lamb, where everything will be in abundance. There will not just be the abundance of wine, but the abundance of life. Jesus showed here the natural world is subject to him. And what seems impossible to man is possible for Jesus. And he is so good. He is willing to let his first miracle to be this strange one, just to spare a young couple humiliation. He didn't do it so people will see it. It wasn't even wrote about until John. He did it out of love, compassion, and kindness. Let me tell you, when Jesus goes to a wedding, it's a wedding you'll never forget. And when Jesus gets involved in our lives, he does things that we'll never forget. Remember, Jesus gives more than you can ever need. We thank him for his abundant, endless love to us.